Before we get into this week's episode, I want to make a plug for Art Market Minute. This is ArtNet News' new micro-podcast hosted by Margaret Kerrigan, who's the site's news editor Europe. It offers a weekly snapshot of essential art market news expertly compiled by the ArtNet Pro editorial team.
I definitely left it feeling uplifted and having learned a lot, but did I have like a feeling about what the thesis was telling me in terms of like bringing the past and the present together? It sort of felt vague in the end. Would you guys agree with that?
Well, the show's growing on me, is one thing I'll say.
I'm Kate Brown, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast by ArtNet News. So we are back for our roundup where we look at some of the headlining stories of the past month. But really, let's be honest, in the art world, there's really just one headlining story, and that is the 60th edition of the Venice Biennale, which opened to the public last Saturday. Brazilian curator Adriana Pedrosa's Foreigners Everywhere was a major feat, and it brought together more than 330 artists and collectives, the vast majority of whom have not been seen at the Biennale before, so it was truly exciting. And then all over Venice, there were scores of collateral shows, galleries that brought their own exhibitions, private foundations pulling their weight as well with all their palazzos. And so the lagoon was busy. And as we know, it's a challenge to get anywhere fast in a city without cars and bikes. And it's very easy to get lost along the way, but there was a lot of great art to see. And so I'm really excited to talk about it today. With my formidable colleagues, I'm joined by my co-host, Ben Davis. Hi, Ben.
Kate, it's so nice to see you again. Although I will say it was very nice to see you in person in Venice. It doesn't happen enough.
Definitely. We will get into all of the things that we did. And we're also joined today by our acting editor-in-chief, Naomi Rea. Hey, Naomi, again.
Hi, Kate. Can't wait to get into it.
So as we do on the show, we tend to circulate through 3 conversation hubs. But as I said, there's really just one main one, but we are still going to pivot around 3 points. We're going to start by talking about Pedrosa's main show and some of our big takeaways. And then we can chat through the protests that took place around the Biennale last week, which was a big story. And then we will talk about the nation-state pavilions, the hits and the misses, and the stories that emerged from there. So before we get started, as we already briefly mentioned, we were all in Venice last week. And I don't know about you guys, but I am tired and having trouble talking.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Are you even close to recovering yet, Naomi?
No, I'm sick, but I have enough voice left for this. I mean, I couldn't miss it.
I mean, these are well and truly small complaints, but it can't be overstated, how exhausting something like this is. For an event that is about, seeing art and is sort of synonymous with this kind of globetrotting lifestyle, it is just exhausting. I mean, there's just way too much to see. There's no way I can start this conversation without feeling underprepared. I just know that there are things you guys have seen that I haven't seen. I think I'm really going to benefit from getting a sense of what stood out to you.
Yeah, the biennial really breeds this feeling of missing out. If you're not there, you feel like you've missed something. But if you are there, you feel like 2 canals over, you're missing something. A complete view of it is impossible. So obviously we won't get through everything today, but we'll try.
I should say, on top of all the stuff to see, there are all the people to see. I mean, it really does concentrate the art world in one place. So at the same time, you're always rushing off to see a different event or, racing through a show with hundreds or thousands of artworks. You're also navigating all these people coming at you. There's maybe your one chance to see, in my case, my colleagues, you guys, or, just people from around the world. That is really a rare opportunity to see. So, on every level, you leave the experience feeling overstimulated.
For sure.
So where was the place in the biennial that you ended up bumping into the most people? Because for me, it was the line for the Canada Party.
Oh my God. And were people ever mad in that lineup? I think that is another funny social dynamic that emerges in Venice, where you have all the VIPs of the art world, and then they're all pushing past each other, almost falling into the lagoon, trying to get in this party. And they all are VIPs, so no one's more important than the other one.
VIP communism, yeah.
I ran into a lot of people at the donor shop, the only place in Venice that's open at 1:30 in the morning. I went with our European news editor, Margaret Kerrigan, on the way home, and it was so funny in there. Like there was literally, I'm not going to name names, but just like a hilarious medley of art advisors and collectors and patrons and curators just like trying to get a sandwich. And I was like, well, this is a secret spot for getting some news, maybe.
That's hilarious. That's hilarious.
Yeah, there's that place, or there's that off one corner of St. Mark's Square, there's one bar that is open past, 3 a.m., which everybody just will filter through at some point on their way back home.
Yeah, I think I spent a good 30 minutes trying to buy some spritzes there, past midnight.
So let's turn to the main exhibition. As I mentioned earlier, this is like a monumental show. We'll barely be able to cover a slice of it, but we will try. Maybe, Ben, you could give us a bit of a walkthrough because I think you spent the most time there out of all of us.
Sure. So I went into this experience this week with the task to review the show, to give first impressions on it, and then to review the show more extensively later. So the Venice Biennale always has this big curated centerpiece where one international curator is chosen in order to make a statement about art. And you interviewed Adriano Pedrosa in a previous edition of this podcast, Kate, so people will have some sense of this show. But it's spread between two, or depending on how you want to count, 2.5 venues, the main central pavilion in the Giardini, and then the Arsenale, which is this big sort of industrial space or former factory space. And then there are a few pavilions out near the water and in the garden where there are artworks tucked away. Very, very big show. The theme, foreigners everywhere, focusing on themes of migration and otherness. I think the show makes a warm first impression. I can't help but compare it to Cecilia Alemani's show from 2 years ago. It has some similarities and some differences for people who remember that event. But I would say, yes, as an opening gambit, the first thing almost everybody was talking about was that there are a lot of dead people here. I do think it is a show where the dead outnumber the living by a lot. And that has an interesting effect on me, as I'm going through it. I really am constantly wondering, what this says about contemporary art, that there's so much of this art is coming from the past. What was your guys' first impression of the show?
I mean, it was very colorful. The central pavilion in the Giardini, on the outside, there's an installation or mural from an indigenous Brazilian art collective. And I think that is the first thing that kind of impacts you, because that's usually a white building. And I think on the inside, color is repeated everywhere. It's kind of a rainbow biennial in many ways.
For sure.
Yeah, it's stunning. The facade is stunning. I mean, it really just draws you in. I feel like, this Brazilian curator, there's that traditional classical facade, and here it's just completely decked out in these like vibrant, warm colors, and really sets this certain kind of tone, bringing you in. Kate, did anything stand out to you about the show? Did you even get a chance to spend a lot of time in the show?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I walked through both of it. I had the pleasure of also being not stuck, but it was hailing and everyone ran into the Giardini and then we couldn't leave, but it was a great place to be stuck in for about an hour and a half. So I really got to see that part of the show. And I also went through the Arsenale, which actually impressed me more. As you said, I interviewed Adriano. One of the things he was emphasizing was these like historical nuclei that he had. And so I was very curious, as you mentioned, Ben, how this kind of interplay would work with like dead and living artists, because biennials generally are about the zeitgeist and are about like what is happening now. But I very much understand the desire and the need to like incorporate overlooked artists who were ignored in there now. So no argument there. But nevertheless, how was that actually going to feel? And I definitely felt that it was museological. Like you really had to sort of lean in and look at didactic panels. And there was so many histories that you could barely even grasp the amount of stories that were in these historical zones. Because there were just like, in some cases, I mean, almost like 50 paintings in like one small area. So I was definitely a little bit underwhelmed by how that kind of interplayed. But that being said, the entire show on the whole, I didn't feel overwhelmed. I felt like it was really well paced. It was very generous to the viewer. Like the videos, they really were like digestible in their length, and the works just like had this nice pacing to them. And I definitely left it feeling uplifted and having learned a lot. But did I have like a feeling about what the thesis was telling me in terms of like bringing the past and the present together? It sort of felt vague in the end. Would you guys agree with that?
Well, the show's growing on me is one thing I'll say. And that is something, in relation to what we were just talking at the beginning or chatting about at the beginning about the overstimulation of the experience. Like these kind of shows sort of accentuate a certain overstimulated feeling because it's just so much coming from so many different directions. And then this show is in particular about a certain kind of decentering operation, There's a great amount of art there that I don't have a background in. So you're absorbing a lot of alternate histories you don't know at once. So I'm really benefiting from being able to go back and take the time to read through all that material. That having been said, I kind of agree with you, Kate, and there seems to be some conversation about those historical shows. Like for people who haven't seen it, they're like these galleries that concentrate a lot of art, like portraiture by various artists from the Global South, and then different kinds of abstraction from the Global South. And it's a lot. That definitely like the image I'll remember from this show. It's just all this stuff crowded together. And for me, I'm just like drawn to that material. Like I'm so excited by it. Just the sense of all this historic work that is new to me and is just opening these new passageways into history. But at the same time, it does feel like there's a certain kind of like frenzied quality to it. Like we're working really hard to catch up. We have a lot of ground to cover here, and we're going to throw a bunch of stuff at you all at once. And I am just a sucker for context. There's a certain sense where it's like it almost undermines its own thesis, which is like we need to like look outside of our expectations and like alternate histories center them. And then the fact that like none of them really are centered, they're all completely presented en masse.
I think you're correct in some respects, but I do think there are a lot of stateless positions or positions of people who have been marginalized. Yes, they're all coming together, but I think that it's that together that Adriana Pedrosa has created a biennial where there is space. I think that beautiful work by the Mataho Collective from New Zealand, a group of 4 Maori women, which won the Golden Lion in the main exhibition in the Arsenale. It's this beautiful thatched installation that kind of forms a roof over your head as you're coming in. And it comes from this tradition of these birthing mats, coming in and hearing these perspectives and seeing them and in this kind of womb-like environment. Didn't feel vague to me. I felt quite held.
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify the vagueness, I'm specifically talking about how the historic works interplayed with the present works. Like the Mataho Collective was a contemporary work, and I thought the contemporary was really powerful for me. It was just, I wasn't always quite sure how I was supposed to take in this mass of art that was hung salon style from, an entire 20th century of like missed history, and then try to like fold that in to the Mataho Collective, for example. So it was that kind of positioning that ended up feeling a bit like I wasn't sure what was supposed to be empowered in that moment.
Yeah, I mean, let me just give an example of an artwork that I'm definitely going to take away from this show. In the section on portraiture, the Nucleo Historico section on portraiture, there's this sculpture that when I was there, it didn't even stand out to me. It wasn't even accented to me because it's amid so much stuff. And then I was going back last night preparing for this, like reading over the materials around it. It's this work by artist originally from Colombia. His name is Romulo Rosso, and it's called Bachue, Diosa Generatriz de los Chibchas from 1925. And this is like a fantastically historical sculpture. I don't know how to describe it, except it's sort of like a goddess figure. This bottom half has snakes on it. And this is like a sculpture that generated an entire art movement around it. And in some ways, I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to be exposed to that history. And in another way, it's like, yeah, I almost missed it, and it's my job to look. And I do feel like there's this real hurry to catch up, to make a statement. And I'm just a sucker for clarity and context, I guess is what I'd say. And that in some ways, there could have been an entire show of just this artwork and artworks that were inspired by it. And in some ways, that would have done more as a gesture than to have all this together. But it's a trade-off, and to be fair, this is something that is a problem with these shows in general.
Yeah, it was like a big swing to kind of try this approach. And I think it is largely successful.
Any other highlights for you?
There were several works by Indigenous artists in the main show, in the Arsenale. I spent more time there than in the central pavilion in the Giardini. I think I preferred that part. There was more contemporary work there. There's an Indigenous artist, Emmy Whitehorse. She did these beautiful kind of abstract paintings. I mean, if you look at them, they kind of just look like beautiful abstractions, but then you sort of read about them and you see that these are actually abstractions that kind of represent the changes to the land after fracking in Navajo areas in the US. And it's just kind of astonishing. Like, I think that was a theme in there. There was a lot of works that kind of spoke to dark realities, but in a beautiful way. They kind of did it through abstraction and through beauty. And I really liked that. What about you, Kate?
Two of my favorites were two video works, like the Bushra Kalili, the mapping journey, which was like a series of close-ups of maps and then hands of asylum seekers, like showing how they had traveled to get to where they were going and just like plotting their paths and explaining it. I thought this was like really impactful. And then, of course, the work that ended up winning a special mention, Karima Ashadu's Machine Boys, which was like this really kind of visceral video work that was about the Okada Motorcycle Club in Nigeria and kind of looking at the like super patriarchal macho ideals of like Nigerian society through female gaze. I thought this work was just so amazing. What about you, Ben?
Well, you know, again, something that is appearing to me as I look back on the show that didn't read to me when I was there is how many groups of families there are in this show. Because I have to admit that my first impression of the show is that there are long passages of it that are kind of samey. You know, that there are these works hung facing each other that reads to me as like a folk art aesthetic or an aesthetic channeling some kind of like mythical energy that look very similar. And took me until I like really spent time like going through all the material to realize that this is often because Pedrosa has hung family members near each other. So in the Arsenale, there are these big works by Rember Yahuarcani, who's an artist from Peru, that are hung opposite works by Santiago Yahuarcani, who is Rember's dad. I believe there's even a film about their relationship called Song of the Butterflies. And this is really making me think, because it's a real theme in the show. Back in the Central Pavilion, there are these tiny little paintings from Guatemala by an artist named Andres Karuchich, who is described as the most important painter in Guatemala. And they're opposite these paintings that did look very similar to me, who is Rosa Elena Karuchich, who is his granddaughter. It doesn't even say that in the show. You would have to infer that from their similar names or do the research in both cases. But it really is making me think, because my first reaction is like, how are these artists being treated as individuals? Do I have even the standards to think about what they're doing in terms of them as individual artists? And then there is an interesting thing where placing family members together, it does sort of emphasize that there's a communal aspect to creativity, and where these art objects, if that's how we're going to approach them, come from, that has to be reckoned with. I don't actually know what to do with that thought. It's just a thing that's emerging to me as I think about the show.
Yeah, that was definitely a very unique part of it. And, you know, we often think about networks and how artists develop styles. Like the Casablanca School, I think there was like at least one or two artists from there that were on view in the show. But I had definitely never thought about family before. I mean, there were so many discoveries. But you know what I will say, I was walking through the show also thinking about Documenta 15 a lot. You know, Ben and I were both there. And of course, scandals notwithstanding, that show was a show that brought the global South into a European context in a way that was extremely disruptive and to the sort of canons of art as we know them here. And I definitely left Bruin Grupa's exhibition like my center was completely off. Like, I don't even know how to look at anything. I don't know how to judge things anymore. And that was such a refreshing feeling. And this show was a little bit more hand-holding in the Western canon, which was what made it so easy and enjoyable, but it was also like, didn't touch my soul in the same way. I don't know if you, Ben, if you have a thought about those two shows and how they compare.
Well, I think they're both shows that are not about the West, I guess I would say it. They actually almost feel to me like they're defined negatively against what's not in them as much as they are defined positively, and creating some kind of new circuit of artists. I actually think that this kind of social practice art is also, at a certain extent, that people are like, this is this radical way of working from outside the West, when to me, it's like, these are the kind of projects that nonprofits like. You know, they like things that have social impact and involve like the community. So I think you can make some of the same critiques about the rhetoric of offering you something total other that totally decenters you, while at the same time actually working in like modes that might be more familiar, could hold between both shows. I would say about this show, Foreigners Everywhere, that what strikes me about it is that it's very, very earnest. There's this real rhetoric of authenticity around all the stuff in it that's almost out of fashion. And just, again, thinking about it afterwards, it really strikes me as how there's all this work by indigenous artists from around the world, and there's a very popular contemporary art version of kind of art about indigeneity that is specifically about the cliches and stereotypes that artists from indigenous backgrounds face, kind of like riffing on them, playing with them, throwing them back in your face. You know, I think of the late Jimmy Durham, who I know is controversial for his own reasons, but was a very important artist, and is really about reckoning with how artists from these kind of backgrounds interface with a community that kind of looks to the other, looks to other cultures as a resource of authenticity and so on, and the burdens that imposes on them. And that is not the conversation in this show's head at all. There isn't a note of skepticism or addressing that potential criticism within this show.
You raised Documenta as an example of a point of comparison, and I was thinking about people's reactions to Documenta and to the Berlin Biennale that came straight after it that year, and comparing it to people's reactions to this biennial. I think Documenta, there was a lot of people, they came out and they were like, oh, this is unwatchable. Some of this social practice art is really stretching the limits of what belongs in a biennial sphere, or it's doing too much in one way and not enough in the other. And then you see a show like this and it's raising similar questions in a much more kind of aesthetic way. There was a lot of painting, like very digestible. We can look at this and we can ask some of these same questions, but it looks more like a traditional art show. I thought it was interesting to just see the same people making a comment about that art not being art enough, but this art being too much art.
Yeah.
Such an interesting point. And I do think that there is the secret bridge is the art market because this show, it decentered the West for sure. And it was very successful in that. And it also decentered like traditional perspectives on art in general, even if there were artists that are maybe based here now. However, the difference was that also at Documenta, there wasn't this art market that was sort of holding up the show. And here you could feel it. Like Louis Fertino is an art market star. Frida Terenzo-Jaeger is a rising star. She's super successful. And that's not a negative comment, but it is just nevertheless like they're one of the margins of the art market in every instance in this exhibition, you know?
Yeah, I think that those two examples that you brought up are actually the quite obvious ones. I think just to counter that point a little bit, one of the things that people were saying, there were a lot of established galleries who actually don't have artists who are represented in this exhibition. And in the run-up to the Biennale, these galleries were sort of asking, well, how are they funding this Biennale if they don't have us? So that was just something that was kind of in the ether on the way up. So I think it would be interesting to look at the funding and where it's come from and whether it is actually tied to these market players in the same way it has historically been.
I think that's right. And it's also like Documenta is a very well-funded show and the biennial is not. And so I think that even just showing as few market artists as Adriano did is like an achievement in and of itself. And so, yeah, I totally agree. Speaking of the artists in the show, there was definitely some gestures of pro-Palestine support that were integrated into the artworks, which was throughout the Arsenale and the Giardini in different instances. And that brings us to our second point today, which was to talk about how the conflict in Gaza was playing out in the Biennale. So ahead of the public opening on Saturday, on Tuesday, Ruth Patir, who was the artist who was supposed to show and open the Israeli pavilion, announced with the New York Times that she was going to keep her pavilion closed. This obviously was a huge story, a sort of surprising turn, although I think everybody anticipated that there was going to be something happening on this front. There's so much tension around this. That was the big news last week. And then, of course, there was a protest on Wednesday that began at the Israeli pavilion, and then they marched past Britain and then France, and then they landed in Germany, which is sort of a marker of exactly some of the countries that have contentious involvement in different ways in this conflict. So yeah, I'm curious, did you guys walk past the Israeli pavilion? Were you around at the protests at all?
Yeah, I saw the Israeli pavilion from the outside, and the first thing I heard before I'd even arrived, before the biennial had opened on its pre-opening day, the New York Times landed that news, and I thought it was quite interesting that that happened before the biennial even opened, and it was probably a smart way to diffuse what would have most certainly been, I think, a larger site of protest if the artists had not taken that statement.
Because this had been building for a little while. I mean, there was a petition by the Art Not Genocide Alliance, ANGA. Thousands and thousands of people had signed demanding that Israel not be shown because of the ongoing horror show unfolding in Gaza.
Yeah, so I do think it did diffuse a little bit because there were protests, and there definitely were visible signs that protests had happened. ANGA stickers around the place, flyers in the dust, banners and things around. But I think the feeling of protest wasn't as big as I had been anticipating. I had been anticipating this biennial as being much more of like okay, we're on the ground doing news in a reactive way in a kind of protest environment where we're going to have to be quite nimble and sort of adapt and figure this out. And actually, it was kind of centered around in front of the Israeli pavilion. And there were a few angles that kind of developed sort of in reaction to what had happened there, in reaction to the statement. Was it the right kind of statement? Was the statement a big enough statement? There was a lot of sort of chatter about the fact that the pavilion doors were closed, but you could see the video playing, and whether or not that's a valid sort of complaint about the statement is something that people were kind of debating. There was nothing that I was trying to do that week that a protest got in between me and that thing.
Yeah, certainly compared to what's going on in the United States right now, where like college campuses are like melting down over this, or even Google had to fire a bunch of people for doing a sit-in over the company's contracts with Israel. Nothing felt that combustible. It did feel like that it was the subtext of everything.
Yeah.
The protest succeeded in making this an unavoidable conversation, which I think is something. And to me, this show, curated by a Brazilian about foreigners everywhere, at this moment, this question, aside from just the fact that a couple million people are facing starvation right now, it would be impossible not to address the question in some way. And at the Venice Biennale, in good and bad ways, is the Olympics of the art world in the sense that it has this national quality. It was going to be a place where people from the global north, from America and Germany, for instance, were going to be confronted with the fact that a lot of the world views what's happening right now and the support of their respective nations for what's going on in Israel as extremely disgraceful. And despite the fact that I don't think spectacular protests dominated the event, I feel like that sense was everywhere.
Yeah. And, I think that is also something that had to do with social media, too. So like the Giardini, the protest itself, I think, took place over an hour and a half. There was no police intervention, which is very different from what happens here. So I think that Adriano also, setting the stage to be like, we will not interfere with this. People can express themselves. Like he did say that in our interview ahead of the show. And I think that also allowed these things to happen and then also end, and everybody felt like they could be heard, which was really important. But then to come back to the social media angle, the virality of the footage and then the reposts and the discussions that started happening online. I was like walking to the Giardini. I was looking at my phone going like, oh my gosh, like this is really popping off. And then you get there and like, it was sort of like all quiet. I think I felt like that was a sort of a strange discrepancy in a way.
And I should say, despite the fact that I didn't personally run into a protest while I was there, partly I was completely swamped with the task at hand for me, but it did penetrate the actual biennial in various ways. So that, like, if you were in the Arsenale, there's a particular section called the Disobedience Archive, which is a collection of, like, political videos cataloging various kinds of artistic political actions. And a few of those artists had put stickers saying that they supported the Art Not Genocide Alliance next to it, so that within the show itself, you saw like a small display of support. And one of those artists, Daniela Ortiz, who has a sort of puppet show video from 2022 called The Brightness of Greedy Europe, had inserted a graphic into their video that said, "Boycott Israeli Pavilion, Free Palestine." And then, Naomi, since you were there, I wondered if you'd say something about the special mention that went to Samia Halabi, a Palestinian-American artist, which seemed to me essentially a political statement.
Absolutely. So Samia Halabi is a Palestinian-American artist. She is 87 years old, I think, and she was awarded a special mention for a 1969 painting entitled Black is Beautiful. It's a very beautiful pink and purple kind of abstraction of a cross that is named for the Black Liberation Campaign of the same name. It feels to me like a beautiful painting, an American painting, if you are sort of thinking about the social context in which it was produced. But I'm not surprised, obviously this is how she's introduced as a Palestinian artist, that it's sort of thought of like, oh, this is like a nod to this subtext that has been everywhere. And I would say that, yeah, it could have been. And she certainly used her moment when she accepted the award to dedicate it to members of the press and the public in Gaza who have been documenting what is going on there right now, and they have lost their lives in the course of that. So she definitely did use that platform to make that statement. But I do think that if the jury was looking to kind of make a political statement in that special mention, then I think there were other works in the main show that they could have done that through. I mean, there was one work by another Palestinian Saudi artist called Dana Awartani, this enormous textile installation in the Arsenale, the big yellow and orange draped textiles, which it's memorializing cultural sites that have been destroyed in the Arab world by war and terror throughout history. And she actually updated the work where she's basically, for each sort of cultural site that she's kind of memorializing, she tears the fabric and then she's darned it back together. And she updated that work to memorialize sites in Gaza that have been devastated. So this was a work that very explicitly by the artist mentioned this. So if it was a solely political statement, and this was a very big installation in the main exhibition, I think that would have been the more obvious place to go. So I just wouldn't want to take away from like Samia Halabi's moment in getting a special mention in the Venice Biennale for a work that is, I think, hooked into the time and place that it was made, and let her have her moment there, as much as she also wants to put out a message about what's going on in Gaza today. That was just my take on that.
I think it could be both, right? Because just to be clear, this particular artwork is in the historic section that we talked about. It is part of this gallery of forms of historic abstraction. So unlike the work that you mentioned, it does not really like leap out amongst the many other genres of abstraction there. It is hung really closely with other things. Once it got its mention, I went back to like read the label, and I'm curious to know more about this artist. And I really would need to do a lot more research. Like, I'm not even clear whether this work was made in the United States or elsewhere, or what the context really was. So I think it can be both, basically, is what I'm saying.
I'm curious, Naomi, what were the reactions also during the press conference? Because I think, as I think we spoke about on earlier podcasts, there's also the new government in Italy and the culture minister who I'm sure was handing out these awards. There's a right-wing government at the moment. So just wondering how that played out.
I think I kind of echo just the sense that people were being allowed to say things. And so there wasn't that same kind of tension of like a very controlled environment. The artists who spoke were able to make statements about what they wanted to, and I was kind of looking around for a reaction, but they kind of just allowed people to speak and moved on. So there's been a shift in the biennial, and we haven't spoken about this yet, actually, but ahead of the biennial, a lot of people were kind of talking about, oh, is this going to be the last biennial or the last free biennial? Because the Italian government has put in a right-wing journalist as the president who will kind of be overseeing the next edition of the biennial. And there was a lot of debate over whether this kind of level of like freedom of speech and sort of the choice would be permitted in the future. And so the Italian culture minister, he sort of closes out the awards ceremony by assuring the public that the curator who will be appointed for the next Venice Biennial will always have autonomy and freedom to develop the project that they want, which I thought was a kind of poignant sort of way to end, that if there were eyebrows being raised, he was sort of trying to quash that and reassure people that this isn't the last biennial.
Well, that's encouraging, for sure. There was a lot of concern about that, and there will continue to be until we sort of go into the Giardini in 2 years' time, I'm sure. So, yeah, maybe transitioning from that jury award ceremony, we can also start talking about the pavilions, which is obviously a main feature of why everyone goes to Venice. And Giardini is, of course, this beautiful garden where many countries, but not all of them by far, many countries that had positions of power in the early 20th century have these standalone spaces where they can show art. And there's been a few added, but it's woefully underrepresentative of the world. Nevertheless, there was a lot of amazing art there and a couple amazing works that won. So maybe you could just chat through who won the Golden Lion this year.
Yeah, sure. So the Golden Lion winner for the National Pavilion was Archie Moore, a First Nations artist representing Australia. And the installation in the Australia Pavilion was essentially a family tree. So Archie traced back his own family tree, and there's a lot of kind of difficulty, I think, in First Nations in Australia with that kind of historical documentation. He's painted the inside of the pavilion black, and he's done these chalk drawings of a family tree. So it's very kind of, in a way, like it's quite quiet, but I think there are thousands of entries that he has traced. Some of them are blank because he couldn't find documentation of the name of that person. And then in the center of the pavilion, there is stacks of documents in the center of a kind of reflecting pool, which represent his research into his family tree. And they're all, most of them anyway, are sort of state documents, a lot of kind of coroner's reports from the state, basically, which kind of says something about the rate of incarceration of First Nations people. I think as a pavilion, a lot of people missed it.
I missed it, for sure.
It wasn't one of those pavilions that people were like, oh, this is definitely going to win. So it was interesting to see it, although in other ways quite expected. The forefronting of Indigenous perspectives was something people were talking about this biennial before it opened, before anyone saw anything. So I think, if you were kind of trying to predict who's going to win based on the information that you had going in, like you would probably beeline for the Indigenous people who were representing their nations.
Yeah, that's something I'd say about, and I should say you both saw more national pavilions than I did. I mean, I was consumed with the task of trying to say something about the Central Pavilion, and it's just a whole other task. I got enough of a look at the national pavilions to have this conversation, but not much more. From my impression, the theme, Foreigners Everywhere, of the main pavilion was like the theme of the surrounding pavilion. It felt like either because artists and nations were responding to Pedrosa's prompt, or because it does generally represent the interests of the international art world at this time, that in pavilion after pavilion, the themes of the Central Pavilion did repeat.
Yeah, but I think that they do respond to the prompt. That's at least what they say. Although one wonders, because you have to be planning much earlier than he announces the concept for his show. I think that the Giardini was more cohesive than it's ever felt before. It's hard to find a sense of cohesion, obviously, when there's like 30 different artists. And of course, all the pavilions that are outside of the Giardini and in the Arsenale. But it was very moving to see all of these different solo and group exhibitions. I'm curious, like, what you thought maybe was going to win, because there were a lot of really strong standout pavilions this year.
We wrote an article about the standout pavilions, and it's hard to, when you're on the ground, determine that, especially if you've not had a comprehensive look at everything to kind of pick out what stands out.
And there's no way you could. I mean, it's so much. There's no way you could. There are 90 pavilions, and only some of them are central. And if you want to do the work of investigating the marginalized countries, the countries who aren't grandfathered into the Central Pavilion, that's a lot of boat rides.
Exactly. So when it came down to the task of kind of early guessing, I would be lying if I said that it had nothing to do with the long lines outside, that I selected the Egyptian pavilion.
Sure.
Clearly, a lot of people were interested in it. There was very long lines outside early on.
That's Wel Shaki, right?
Yeah, Wel Shaki. I will say it's worth, is anything worth a 3-hour line? I'm not sure, but it was worth skipping the line to go and see. It was a beautiful film, sort of musical film, sung in classical Arabic and very beautiful, kind of set in the Arabi Revolution. And I think it spoke quietly to some of the issues in the Arab world and in the Middle East today in a way that spoke about myth and historical revisionism in a way that I think was quiet and I think opened up sort of a little bit of space for historical analysis and reflection in a way that I think is really difficult to do that, especially when talking in that space today. So that was kind of my take. That was why I liked the film.
Also, just Wel Shaki, a fantastic artist who has like a fantastic body of work. It would have made a lot of sense as a pavilion to honor. Kate, what about you? What did you think would win?
Well, what I think would win are not my favorites, but I definitely thought that Jeffrey Gibson's pavilion was just getting so much traction. People were talking about it. Even if people were like talking about whether they liked it or not, like it was just like a really like big talking point. And of course, like really important subject matter that was executed like really meticulously. And other than that, I also thought that Julien Cruzet, who was representing France, might have been a contender. So those were my two.
Describe that pavilion, because I could not make heads or tails of it. I mean, maybe I was just at that point in my Venice journey where my brain was fried by too much intake. But I walked into the French pavilion and I was like, what is this? It's like this underwater animation scene.
He's a French Caribbean artist. There were these hanging sculptures that were like going into these baths that had very particular herbs. And then there were these large screens that were displaying this beautiful sound piece. And the sensations of being in there, it was like the sound, the smell, the kind of way that the sculptures were like cutting through the space. I was lucky to go on Tuesday in this kind of like secret preview day where you were at the Arsenale. So I was there by myself. I was like imagining the jury walking through this. And I was like, oh yeah, this is really like hitting a lot of notes, you know?
The German pavilion was the other one that had long lines. Too long for me.
There was a line within a line. That was the crazy thing. You lined up outside and then you had to line up inside.
Did you like it? What'd you get out of it?
One thing I was thinking about was there wasn't exactly this kind of, and this is not a comment on the German pavilion yet, but like this Anna Imhoff moment where like a couple of years ago, everyone was like, this is the best piece of work in the Giardini or of the national pavilions. And I felt this year that in the evenings when I was talking to people, we were having a lot of disagreements. But anyway, the German pavilion, there was 2 artists in the main space, and then there was an island that had another few artists. And in the main space, there was Yael Bartena, who's an Israeli artist who makes a lot of video works, and Ersan Montag. A lot of the German pavilions tried to deconstruct the German pavilion because it was built by the National Socialists. So it's very problematic architecture. So Ersan Montag had covered the inside with this asbestos, and he had built a house inside, which was what was causing the like inside lineup, where there was this theater piece that was playing out on multiple floors. So there was this house within a house. And then Bartena had made this sci-fi video work that was kind of playing out on either side. It was very dark. It was very cinematic. It was quite an impactful pavilion, but it divided opinions. Did you guys get to go inside?
Yeah, I went inside. I didn't find it like as enthralling as I would have expected. To be honest, I didn't see the second part of the pavilion on the island, so maybe I missed something significant from the show. The only island I went to was Giudecca, which is where the Vatican pavilion was.
Right, you went to the Vatican pavilion. How was that?
It was intense, you know. It was a full half-day exercise, essentially, because the Vatican, or the Holy See officially, was putting its pavilion inside a functioning women's prison. So I went there. To be honest with you, I was quite suspicious from the off about the idea of kind of using a women's prison as a backdrop for a pavilion in the Venice Biennale. I've written about some art projects in prisons a couple of times, and so I think like I have some sensitivity to the issues that are involved and how you engage with incarcerated people in a respectful way. And so I think ahead of time, I was kind of just a little bit suspicious about the care that was going to be demonstrated towards these women. And having seen it, I haven't really changed my position. I think it was quite hastily organized. There were artworks that genuinely attempted, and I think sincerely attempted to engage with these women. But if you have a month to produce something for an art show and, you know, you have like a day or half a day with the women who are living there, I don't think you can really produce something that really changes the conditions of their life in a meaningful way.
Except, didn't you say there's a neon artwork there that
well, yeah.
You got the impression being there that people were putting up curtains to keep the light out of their cells?
Yeah, I mean, Claire Fontaine, the artist who created the Foreigners Everywhere work that the biennial is named after, it's a neon installation that lights up at night and it says, "We're with you through the night." It's a very sort of comforting message, but I could see in the
unless
in the cells.
It's like, "We're with you through the night" is like this light is with you all through the night.
I'm trying to sleep.
People sort of, they didn't have curtains, so they were erecting makeshift curtains with clothes on the cells. But I mean, to be fair, I don't know if they turned it off at night. I'm assuming they probably turned it off at night, at least some time.
Probably was annoying during the day too. Well, we covered a lot of ground. We missed talking about so many things that are worthwhile talking about. And I honestly, like in the days after I've returned from Venice, I feel this very strong desire to go back and revisit it. It's been really nice running through this with you guys. Thank you so much for coming on today. And it was great to see you in La Serenissima.
So great
Absolutely.
to see you too. And thanks for this conversation. I feel like we didn't even scratch the surface of what's there.
Absolutely. Too much to say. I'll be thinking about the show, thinking about this conversation long after we're done.
And I'm looking forward to reading your digested review of it, Ben.
Yes, same here. So that wraps it up for this episode. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, take a moment to rate and review us. It will help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili and Carolyn Goldstein. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.